one of the things I love, and a lot of you guys know, I love radio history. And I'm always reading up on stuff, and I'm always finding out things I never knew in a million years. 3 families in the 1920s in 3 different states started industries unto themselves that in the 1990s all combined together. Here we go with Tandy Corporation, Radio Shack, and Allied Electronics. And in 1919, Dave Tandy and his buddy started a company. His buddy was named Morton Hinckley down in Fort Worth, Texas. They decided, geez, we ought to do something, get in business together. So they started Tandy Company. What they were doing is selling cobblers and shoe manufacturers the soles, the heels, and the shoelaces. And they built up a pretty good sized company from that year after year going forward. Then go to the Deutschman brothers. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. There were 2 English brothers that came over from England, settled in Boston, and they were very interested in amateur radio. And in 1921, they set a store up on Brattle Street. Back east, a lot of the old buildings, I don't know if you've ever watched NCIS, where they had the lab downstairs. You can look up and there's glass around. You can see people walking outside from the cellar. And that's how their shop started, in a cellar office on Brattle Street in Boston. And they were buying surplus electronic gear from the military, from the Army, from the Navy, from World War I. They catered to hams and hobbyists. And one of their first employees was Bill Halligan, that started Helicrafters. And he's the one that came up with the name Radio Shack, because a lot of their shipboard customers, the radio room was called the wireless room or the Radio Shack. So they came up with the Radio Shack name. And Radio Shack grew until about 1935. They moved a couple of times. They finally incorporated. Allied Radio was started in 1921 by a young guy named Cy Wexler out of Chicago. And Wexler started a company called Columbia Radio Corporation. He was building desktop radios, crystal sets. 1928, he spun off another division, and that was called Allied Radios. He was buying parts, wholesale parts, not only sell to customers, hams, hobbyists, but to supply to his radio manufacturing operation. And he was a young guy. At 1928, he was 31 years old. And they grew that company because one of the things he did was one of the first companies to use catalogs to sell electronic products. His first catalogs came out in the early 1930s. And believe it or not, there's a web page on Google that you can see all the old catalogs and thumb through every single page of the old Night Kit or Allied catalogs, the Lafayette catalogs, the Radio Shack catalogs, and it's very, very interesting seeing some of the pricing. So here it is, 1928. His company is growing by leaps and bounds. What was during the Depression, Radio Shack, Allied, their competitors, Lafayette, Newark Electronics, Olson, they all survived, which was very, very interesting. A lot of companies did not survive during the Depression. Come the late 30s, Radio Shack finally figured out they hired a guy to design a catalog for them. They never had a catalog till 1939. And they came out with 25,000 issues in their first catalog. The next year was the 1940 catalog, which came out in 1939, and that had 40,000. Then the war came along. So in order to stay in business, Radio Shack and a lot of the other companies started doing business with the military and the government. Amateur radio was shut down. Switching over to Tandy Corporation got into some real problems because I didn't realize this, but you could only buy during the war years 2 pairs of shoes a year. They were rationed. All the leather was going towards the military. So a lot of their business deteriorated quite a bit. Dave Tandy and his partner were trying to figure out what to do after the war, stay with the business they had. They expanded out to a couple of stores selling their leather goods products. And Dave Tandy's son just came out of World War II from the Navy. His name was Charles. And what he did is he says, look, we need to go into the kit marketplace for leather goods. He says during the war, going to the military hospitals, a lot of the injured troops were building stuff out of leather, like billfolds and knickknacks out of leather. So they went into the hobby leather goods. His partner, Hinckley, split off and took the shoe business. So here it is, 1947. Business is really tough for Allied. They've got 21 stores, hobby stores around the country. And you'll get a kick out of this. In 1953, they built a new warehouse in Chicago, 147,000 square feet for $2 million. They couldn't get the lobby done for $2 million nowadays. And then they offered free shipping on $50 or more. And on their advertisement, which was funny, they showed a train and they showed a truck and eventually they showed a plane for the way they ship stuff. After the war, Radio Shack into the not only the ham business. You can go in their old catalogs and they've got Hallicrafters, they got Hamelin, they got National in there, which surprised the hell out of me. I never thought they had all of that stuff in there. Radio Shack grew to worldwide. Back in the late 50s, they made in early 60s, they made a couple of mistakes. They offered credit to people. So you could go in and put $10 down, take your radio home, or whatever you bought. People didn't pay, and they had a huge loss. And I'll get back to that in a minute as my brain's ticking away here. Tandy Corporation grew and grew and grew to a very profitable company. And Dave, not Dave Tandy, but his Charles, saw that, well, I want to get into the electrical market, the electronics market. He says, a growing market. He saw what a lot of his other dealers were doing, like Lafayette and Buick and other companies doing. And he says, we're going to do two things. They got into the stereo business, so you could buy stereos, turntables, you could buy amplifiers, and then they got the night kits. And the night kits expanded like crazy. And I think a lot of the old timers here, like myself, built night kits, are familiar with the old night kits. He looked for another company to expand out. He saw that Radio Shack had like 9 stores in the region, up in the Boston, New England region. And he bought Radio Shack out for about $300,000. The brothers out of it completely. He, let's see, Tandy, there we, I don't confuse it all. During the 70s, Radio Shack went because they got into the family radio services. They were the first one to sell family radios. They were the first big company to sell CB radios, and that expanded like crazy. They sold over 200,000 CB radios in 2 years' time. That was a big profit maker for them. They expanded out worldwide, Australia, Asia, South America, Europe. By 1969, Radio Shack was doing $4.8 billion a year in sales. They had 7,300 stores worldwide. Then came the cell phone business. They got in first ones to sell cell phones in a chain. They had that big carry phone, Motorola you carry around with the phone on it. I had one of those. They also, in the 90s, partnered up with Sprint. And a lot of stores had Sprint, Radio Shack, Allied. Allied, after they bought Radio Shack, they expanded out. Allied spun off their industrial electronics division to another company. And then Tandy was bought out by LING, Ling Voigt Temco, their Advent division. So Radio Shack and and Allied were a division of LTV Corporation. Realized a lot of gain, profit-wise, from having those companies underneath them. Then it came into the 1990s, and LTV divested themselves of the Radio Shack side of it for $30 million with stock and cash. And Radio Shack got more into the phone business, got more into TVs, got more into non-electronic or electrical products. In the early days, both Allied and Radio Shack were known to have people that worked there understood radio, understood components, understood what they were selling. You get into the late 80s and the 90s, they were just hiring anybody off the street. And the problem was they didn't have any of the components anymore. You just went in there and it was like going into Best Buy. Another thing that hurt them quite a bit is the advent of Circuit City, Best Buy, mail order houses for stereo equipment. Cell phones you could buy almost anywhere by then. And they had put so much of their efforts into the cell phone business with Sprint. Sprint was supposed to pay for half the rent. They were supposed to train the people. They were supposed to subsidize the business, and they didn't. And Radio Shack filed for chapter bankruptcy. Since then, 3 or 4 or 5 different companies have owned them. I think it's a British company, REV, that owns them now.
Is it?
Oh, again, yeah, it's just too bad. The Tandy family walked away with some money. The Deutschman brothers that sold Radio Shack never heard from again.